All right, I'm recording now, so whenever y'all need to, if y'all need to settle.
Ready? Yeah. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Texera, and I am the Prevention Services Director at Crisis Center of West Texas. And joining me is Amy, a Prevention Services Educator here at Crisis Center. And we are here today to talk to you guys about intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence. We know that this can be a difficult topic to talk about, and so if you need to step away from this video for a little bit, if you need to pause it and come back, we totally understand. Please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself.
So first off, I wanted to talk to you guys about who the Crisis Center is. The Crisis Center of West Texas is an agency that supports survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So we have a shelter for survivors or for anyone leaving a dangerous situation. Survivors can go in with any minor children, and even if they have pets. We've found that sometimes people don't feel comfortable leaving if they have to leave their pets behind. So we have kennels and we have a lot of things for them. Then we also provide free counseling and therapy for anyone who has experienced relationship violence or sexual assault in their whole lifespan. So if at any point you've experienced this, you could get counseling. We have case management for survivors, whether they're at the shelter or not, helping with finding work, childcare, or housing, as well as legal assistance for complicated custody, divorce, and protective order cases related to relationship violence. And then we also have the prevention education team, which is what we do. And we go around to schools and we go to events and we try and talk and spread as much information as we can about domestic violence and sexual assault. And we also have a Restart program, which is an accountability class for anyone who has used violence in the past.
Yeah. And while most of our shelter is in Odessa, our offices are in Odessa, but we serve survivors all over West Texas. So if you're listening in from Seminole or Pecos or Monahans, you can always access our services by calling our 24/7 hotline. And all of our services are completely confidential, meaning like if somebody calls to see if you're at the shelter, we can't tell them. They're all offered in English and Spanish, and they're all free. So if you or anyone you know is in need of those services, please call our hotline down here, and we'll be able to connect you to those services. So, Amy, when we talk about like domestic violence or we hear the word dating violence, what do you think people think of, or what comes to mind for people, you think?
So I feel like most people think that domestic violence only happens where the man is the abuser and the woman is the victim.
Yeah.
And we find that that's, not true, although it is more likely for women to be the ones who are victims in domestic violence. There are men also, right? And then another thing is that most people believe that alcohol and maybe issues with anger and drugs are what cause domestic violence. And we know that's not true, although that can make things worse. That is not the cause of domestic violence.
Right.
And then also we know that a lot of people think that domestic violence happens because of stress or maybe, anger problems. And that's what causes a partner to then lose control and be violent. But we are going to talk about, a couple of reasons why that is not, the cause.
Yeah, right. I think like when we think of domestic violence, we think like black eyes or like physical violence. But we want to make sure that we clearly define domestic violence as a pattern of behaviors or tactics that are used by one partner in order to gain power and control over another partner, right? So we're going to talk about a bunch of different behaviors tonight, but they're all all, in domestic violence cases, they're all used within a pattern in order to gain and maintain control over their partner. So a lot of these behaviors might not even be illegal behaviors, but they're used by an abusive partner who is in control and who is trying to maintain that control. So it's not like an out of control rage. It all fits within a pattern.
Right. So since we're saying that domestic violence is a pattern of power and control, someone who is abusive uses many different tactics in order to maintain control over someone. And once they realize that those tactics aren't working to keep someone in control, then that's when they are more likely to turn to physical violence and sexual assault, sexual violence. And so we think of these tactics as many different, or as different types of abuse. And so...
Yeah, and they can look different in every relationship. So we're just going to bounce back and forth some tactics, but please know that you might not see all of these behaviors in every abusive relationship. And so it's important to recognize kind of how they might manifest. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about each one, and then talk about what you can do if you're seeing these behaviors in your relationship or the relationship of somebody that you love. So let's start with emotional abuse, particularly something like gaslighting. What do you think gaslighting is when you hear gaslighting?
So gaslighting is whenever someone is made to believe that they're going crazy or that they like remembered something incorrectly, right? Like,
Yeah.
So whenever I think about gaslighting is maybe someone might like criticize someone, and whenever they go up to them and try to tell them like, hey, I don't like the way that you talked about me, you made me feel bad. And then they might say like, no, I never would have said that. I never said any of that. Like, I would never do that to you because, you know, I care about you or something.
Yeah, exactly. So like emotional abuse can be something like critical, talking about your partner critically, right? And like we get into a relationship with someone because we appreciate their opinion, we care what they think about us. So if your partner is criticizing you, that can definitely be emotionally abusive. But then if they're also making you feel crazy because you try to confront them about the criticism and they say deny it, right? That can also be emotionally abusive. So yeah, making your partner feel crazy, constant criticism. We would see as emotional abuse.
Yeah. Another tactic that's used is isolation. So anytime that a partner would keep someone from interacting with their friends or their family, whether that's like, you can't go over to your family's house because I want you to stay here with me, and trying to always guilt that person into feeling like they can't go and spend time with friends and family, or maybe making them feel like, oh, but your friends and your family, they're no good for you, or they're, you know, they don't know what's good for you. I know what's good for you. Also, maybe even humiliating their partner in front of others. So like maybe you guys do go to family events, and then that person, or to out with your friends, and that person starts to make fun of you in front of your friends, in front of your family, and making you feel smaller, and affecting your self-esteem, and also making you feel like maybe you don't want to go out with your family and friends anymore because now you're embarrassed.
Yeah. Right. And sometimes like if you are out maybe without your partner, and they're constantly checking up on you, constantly calling you, you need to be home right now. You said you'd be home at 5:30. Where are you? That can also be kind of a form of like controlling isolation of I have to know where you are all the time.
Exactly.
And then as things kind of escalate in danger, intimidation can also be a big part of domestic or dating violence. So maybe they haven't physically assaulted their partner, but they've thrown objects or broken objects, damaged objects in front of their partner, and it's kind of communicating like, hey, if you push me on this again, you know, this could happen to you, or something like that. So, you know, I used to work on a domestic violence hotline, and a lot of times we would get calls about people whose partners would hurt their pets, and it was kind of a communication of like, hey, if you cross this line again, this is going to be you, not your pet, right? And so I know that that's kind of triggering to talk about, but intimidation kind of shows this escalation of violence, right? And then sometimes with intimidation, especially if there's been physical violence before, survivors will describe this look that their partner gets before there's some kind of physical assault. And it's hard when you're trying to write a police report or go on scene, officers on scene, and you say, well, I called you because he or she gave me this look. That's difficult to explain, right? So that's what we get at when we talk about a pattern of behaviors. It all is meant to control the partner, but it's not all illegal behavior. But that intimidation piece can be a huge part of domestic violence.
Right. Another thing that we see with intimidation is this whole putting, their hands around a partner's neck.
Oh, yeah.
That's, I think, one of the big things that we like to talk about, which we can probably talk about later.
Yeah, well, and when we get to physical violence, we'll talk a little bit more, but we do like to point out, because it's super important, if there's any kind of threat of strangulation in a relationship, if you hear that from a friend that like, hey, my partner threatened to strangle me, my partner threatened to choke me, whatever they're calling it, you're right, that is like a super serious red flag and indicator of violent and even potentially lethal behavior.
So another thing that we see is coercion. Anytime that they're threatening, well, like we said, pets, but also threatening, if there are kids involved, threatening to take kids away, threatening to hurt people in your family or your friends. Maybe they're not saying they're going to hurt you, but they might try and use someone else to scare you. Or if maybe you're in a relationship and they're threatening to out you and you're not, out yet, and if you're in a same-sex relationship or a trans relationship, you have a trans partner, then, if you are trusting this person and you got into this relationship with this person and suddenly they are trying to make this big decision for you, making that kind of threat can be pretty major. Any sort of blackmailing that can happen. This is someone that you've obviously trusted enough to know a lot about you, and if there's something that they're trying to hold over you, that's a form of abuse.
Yeah. So something like outing a partner, or even if they have images that you might not want released to the world, that we hear that a lot too, of like revenge porn and stuff, and that definitely falls under this controlling behavior, for sure. And then we talked about this a little bit with emotional abuse, but also like minimizing and denying behavior when you bring it up and saying like it's not that big of a deal when you try to confront behavior that you might see as controlling in your relationship. And then also blaming the partner for the abusive partner's behavior, right? So maybe I'm an abusive partner and I'm cheating, but I blame my partner on cheating instead. Or maybe I'm an abusive partner and I become physically or verbally violent and I say something like, well, if you had the house clean when I got home, I wouldn't have had to do this, right? So it's like blaming the other person when really it's the abusive partner who has the violent behavior.
Exactly, yeah. Also telling the partner that no one else would want them and kind of trying to reduce their self-esteem, making them feel like no one else would love you. Look at all this that you do wrong, but look, I love you. So therefore, trying to make that person feel like this is, like I am the one that am struggling, trying to,
put up with you or something.
Yeah, or something like that, trying to be like that, also using male privilege, right? So if it's, basically if it's a male and female relationship, making it known that the female is the one that's supposed to stay home, keep the house clean, and do what he says, and that like that the female partner has to perform sexually, and that there are consequences if she doesn't keep the house, and clean and do everything that he asks. If there are going to be consequences if she does not comply.
Yeah. Yeah. And we recognize that we live in a pretty conservative culture here in West Texas. And so those kind of male female roles are not abnormal, right? So the key here is like there are consequences, right? If those roles are not kept and honored. And like in every relationship, we have to have roles to just like make life work, right? Like somebody's got to do the laundry and somebody has to do the dishes, but it shouldn't just be assumed that like the female partner is going to do that and the male partner isn't. And if it's not that way, then there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I think you touched on this a little bit, too, with the coercion and threats. But children in a relationship can make it really complicated and can be used as a tactic of power and control. So either I'm going to take the children, but even more than that, I think what the using children part really gets at is like maybe making fun of or criticizing the partner in front of the children. So then the children kind of become complicit in the power and control as well. Mm-hmm. We hear about this a lot, how the abusive partner will really kind of almost brainwash the child in thinking that the survivor or the victim is the one who's the problem, right? Mm-hmm. And so then the child really forms a bond with the abusive partner, and that can be really hard on that parent-child relationship, but it's all part of keeping that control.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing would be economic abuse. So basically using any sort of like not letting the partner make their own money, not letting the partner have any control over money so that they don't really feel like they have any choices, right? They can't go out and just buy something. They have to ask for money. And then if they were to try and start a life separate from them, they have nothing to start off with, right?
That's a big piece of control then, right? Like I can't leave because I can't afford to leave.
Exactly. There's no way. Controlling everything. Whenever you control the money, it's controlling every aspect of someone's life and what they can do.
Yeah. And again, I think like in our context here in West Texas, there's a lot of households who can survive on one partner's income, right? Like with the oil field, only one person has to work, but it's really, do you have joint access to assets, to accounts, whatever, that is really a show of equity in the relationship, no matter who's getting the paycheck, right? And then even with all these tactics of control, what we want to point out is that it's only when these kinds of things, this financial abuse, emotional abuse, stop working to control a partner, that dangerous physical abuse or sexual abuse is really heightened, right? So if a partner keeps control by the isolation and the intimidation, they might never have to use physical violence. That doesn't mean that it's not a power dynamic, or that it's not a violent relationship just because there's never physical violence. But when those other tactics stop working as well, or stop serving the abusive partner in the way that they want to, that's when the physical and sexual violence really starts to get heightened. And so the strangulation that we talked about, can become prevalent in those situations. What's really concerning to us about strangulation, and what we want you guys to take away, is that someone who strangles their partner is 7 times more likely to kill their partner. Right. So it is a huge red flag. And there are services, we have a shelter, there are spaces for you to get safe and to talk about that, or if you hear that come up from a friend, speaking up about that can really save a life. So it's really important.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we like to make sure and talk about it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a little bit, there's this question that floats around, and I don't love the question. The question is, why does someone stay in an abusive relationship? I preferred the question to be, why does someone abuse their partner, right? But because it comes up as a question, I want to touch on this thing called the cycle of violence, right? So if you've been in a romantic relationship before, you know that when you get into that romantic relationship, it's like butterflies and sunshine and rainbows, right? It's all great. We call that the honeymoon phase, right? And anyone who's been in a romantic relationship, you've been in that phase, right? We all start there in a romantic relationship, or else like, why would you be in the relationship, right?
In the first place.
So we start there, the honeymoon phase. And then, when you're in a relationship for a while, any relationship, real life starts to happen, right? And things get stressful and hard in any relationship, healthy or not healthy. But someone who's in an unhealthy relationship, particularly a violent relationship, will describe this tension building phase, or like feeling like they're walking on eggshells, and anything that they do, or if they step out of line, might cause their partner to explode, right? And so they're super careful, and they plan around what they know might be some trigger points for their partner, something like that. But then there is some explosive incident, right? Because you can only walk on eggshells for so long. And so as we're making our way around the cycle of violence, there's the honeymoon phase, tension building, there's an explosive incident, and then that abusive partner works really hard to make up for it, right? Because the whole point is to keep control, right? So if somebody says, hey, I'm going to leave because you lashed out at me verbally. Hey, I'm going to leave because you threw your phone near my face. Hey, I'm going to leave because you hurt my dog, right? If they're trying to keep control, they're going to do anything to deter that from happening. So they make up for it, right? I'll never do that again. You deserve better. I can prove it to you, right? And we're all in relationships with folks that we see the best in, right? So we see that, hey, they can change, right? I've seen this good side of them. I know they can be that again. And so, you know, we stay in that relationship, and so those relationships enter back into that honeymoon phase, right? And it goes around the cycle again. But the problem is every time around the cycle, that person has gained more control over their partner and often has become more violent or more like brazen in their violence. And so it becomes more dangerous every time around the cycle. But again, when we talk about like, hey, not all of these instances are illegal, but they all gain control. By the time a cop shows up maybe to a violent incident, they might have gone around the cycle of violence a ton of times, and that control has been established. So you might hear a friend who's tried to leave a relationship a bunch of times, but maybe continues to go back. And that's because that cycle of violence is continuing and that control is really established.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, Amy, what can we look for if we think that there might be a friend that we know that's in a violent relationship?
So what we want to do is notice if there's a pattern, right? If we're noticing that every time we're out with a friend, they're constantly getting calls and constantly having to, report in things like that, or if there's something that, you're noticing, things like that. Maybe trying to notice what, is not being said. Why is someone maybe not, if you see that they're maybe, they can't be away from the partner, if they, aren't able to spend time with you as much as before, and you feel like it's not just the honeymoon that they're so crazy that they want to spend time together, but it's also they literally aren't really allowed to be out with you, right? That's a big thing. If you see that they're changing a lot, maybe a lot of the times self-esteem might go down, things like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, those big changes in behavior, or even changes in appearance, my partner wanted me to have this haircut even though you never wanted that haircut before, right?
Right.
Something like that. Yeah, for sure. So if we see that some of these things are coming up, or maybe we've, a friend pulls us to the side and says I'm really scared or whatever, there's a few things we want you to keep in mind when trying to help a friend who might be going through this. The first thing, and probably difficult for people to understand, is you need to respect your friend's right to make their own decision, right? So they know their relationship best and they know what's safest for them. So a lot of people will be like, well, they're unsafe, so I'm just going to call the cops and have the cops show up at their house. You could create a situation that's way more dangerous for your friend, because your friend might not be ready to leave, right? They might be working on some safety stuff, getting themselves prepared so that they can stay away, whether that's financial or a place to stay or whatever. So you need to be able to have a conversation with your friend, right? And these things we recognize can be really difficult to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
So sometimes it's helpful if you point out something you notice, hey, I noticed that, Sam is calling you every 5 minutes when we're out. I just want to check in. Is everything okay? Right? So maybe point out a particular behavior instead of casting some judgmental statement you know, Sam is so controlling over you, he has to know where you are all the time, or she has to know where you are all the time. That is going to just make your friend really defensive, right? So point out a particular behavior and then try to ask an open-ended question, and then respect their timeline. You've established yourself now as a safe person to talk to, but they might not be ready to receive help right now, and you need to respect that, right? So yeah, is everything okay? I'm concerned about you. I've noticed this, but then respect their space, and even offer, you know, I know that you might be thinking about what is safe for you next. You can always call the crisis center, or we can call the crisis center together. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, sorry. And talk through a safety plan, right? It doesn't have to be the cops that night. But the two most important things you can say are, it's not your fault, right? It's not your fault is so important, because that abusive partner has blamed the abuse on the victim or survivor, right? So reminding them it's not your fault that you're going through this. And also, I believe you, because that's another lie that abusive partners will tell, like, hey, if you try to leave, no one's going to believe you. Oftentimes abusive partners are charmers, right? And so they might look really great to the rest of the community, but in their household, they act really violently. And so it's not your fault, and I believe you. If somebody discloses that they're in a violent relationship, can be imperative to help them feel supportive. But please don't tell them you know how they feel, right? Even if you have also been in a violent relationship, they don't all look the same. And not everyone who's experienced it is the same person, right? So I know how you feel makes people feel like you're minimizing what they're going through. So please don't say, I know how you feel. Please don't force them to get help before they're ready, or be judgmental of what they're going through, right? Just be there to support them. I believe you. It's not your fault, and I'm here for you, right?
Right. So yeah, like we've said, the Crisis Center is, you know, it's free, it's confidential, everything's available in English and Spanish, and the hotline's available 24/7. So if you're, you know, trying to help your friend out, you can always, you know, tell them that. Like we said, you can call in with your friend. We offer emotional support, all sorts of safety planning, and any kind of resources we can provide to get and stay safe. So the survivor will need to be the one that calls into the hotline. You can be there with them, but the survivor needs to make that decision that they want to call into the hotline. And yeah.
And that goes really back to what we started with. The survivor needs to be the one to talk to the hotline and ask for services, because again, if a domestic violence relationship is based off of power and control, part of that survivor taking a next step is choosing what next step and gaining some control back over their own decisions. So so we want them to be able to make those decisions and no one to force them. So yeah, and we are always available to chat. So you can always reach us. Our website is ccwtx.org. I think it's on here somewhere. Yeah. And we also are on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. Our team on Instagram is ccwtx_prevention. Jump on and have a conversation with us there. We're always starting different conversations, so we'd love to connect with you guys. And thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.
What do you guys think?
When we pointed to the sign, did that actually come up on the